Today, I'm going to be talking about understanding bias in AI and how we can notice it and things we can do to mitigate the harms that it causes. So, we're going to look at the causes of it, why it happens, and why it's just a matter of fact with some of the AI that we have out there. Some of the consequences of those different biases that pop up, and then what we do, like we as end users can do. This is more geared towards people who use the AI, not people who manage or build the AI. So, give you some tools on how to mitigate the bias in the AI for your own use. So there are three different types of AI bias, um, and the first one is data bias, and it is the bias that comes from biased data being fed into these machine learning algorithms, and thus, bias in, bias out kind of situation. And a good example of this is a facial recognition system that was trained predominantly on light-skinned people um, that would then perform poorly in identifying or verifying individuals with darker skin tones. I personally saw this as a problem in my previous role at the sheriff's office when we were rolling out facial recognition software, and the algorithm was trained utilizing light-skinned individuals, and it did have a harder time uh, identifying darker-skinned individuals. Um, the second bias that we see is algorithmic bias, when the algorithm itself amplifies the biases in the data. Um, An example of this is an AI powered tool that is used for screening job applicants that might use historical hiring data that was predominantly biased in and of itself to then make decisions on who you should hire in the future. So, as we all probably know, there's a lot of bias in the hiring process, or at least there was previously. So, if you look at successful candidates in previous years and you say this is the shining star candidate and this is what I want my algorithm to serve up to me, you're going to notice the biases that were caused in the previous show up in the algorithm currently. So that would be an example of algorithmic bias. And then the human bias is the final bias. This is the role of either the developers or the end users have in bias that perpetuates AI. An example of this, actually, I'll use my personal example that came up a couple of months ago when I was just playing around with Chat GPT, and I said, "Why don't I make some nice pictures of uh, everybody on my teams and what they're doing, so that I can display it to all of OTIS?" And as I was going down, I was just simply taking the bullet points and making images off of those bullet points, and I didn't notice that one of those pictures was horribly biased towards one of my female team members, and I didn't see it, and I put it up there, and um, eventually somebody pointed it out to me, and I was able to apologize for the problem. But that is an example of human bias coming into this situation and causing this bias to be perpetuated. So, with thinking of those different types of biases, I was going to ask the room if anybody had any examples they could think of any of these types of biases that they've run into or could see us running into in the educational space. It's okay if you don't, but I thought, give it a chance to get a broader discussion going. Um, I I do know of a couple of biases in even in the Chat GPT space and things like that, where they're very homogenous towards certain cultures, and so those chatbots are going to answer as if you're an American, so to speak, or let's say person of lighter skin, and it won't take in cultural differences between uh, non-Americans or differences in ethnic culture. So that's another example that you could think of, and that would actually kind of go with all of those three different biases. All right. Um, the consequences of this bias. Um, Data bias will lead to these outcomes. An example of this would be uh, it's going to lead to that false, going back to the original example of the facial recognition, it can lead to higher rates of false positives for darker skinned individuals, possibly if used incorrectly in law enforcement, leading to uh, higher arrests or different individuals getting approached in a negative way by law enforcement and causing stress and trauma to those who are falsely accused or falsely um, brought forward by these algorithms. So, um, and then for algorithmic bias, kind of what we were talking about previously. Um, Sorry, let me read that question just to make sure it's not. So, yeah, ESL students' writings are more frequently flagged as LLM generated. Yeah, so I can get into talking about uh, AI detectors and tell you how completely not worth it they are because um, it's just it's essentially feeding the prompt through its own AI generator, and it's going to be completely useless. And I wouldn't put any faith into it. So, yeah, but they do get flagged. I've also heard not just ESL, but oh man, my brain went blank. But also, there are other groups that have a higher propensity to get flagged as AI generated um, text. So, yes, but definitely, I think I can't remember which university had the issue, but there was a university that got sued by some of their of students from other countries who were getting failing grades and things like that. And turns out that the teacher was just feeding it into the system, taking whatever the system said, and failing the students, which kind of will come into when we talk about how to mitigate the risks of bias and what we can do to prevent those biases from being perpetrated. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But the I think I was on algorithmic bias. The candidates who are qualified or would make good applicants are completely looked over simply because of an algorithm looked at their resume and saw things that did not indicate they would be an appropriate person, and that could be something as simple as uh, the algorithm scraping a resume, noticing a gap in employment, and completely just throwing them out because the shining star examples never had gaps in their employment. But there's a very good reason. For instance, we just had a global pandemic, and it would reason to believe that some people did not work at some point during that pandemic, but they would get disqualified immediately by the AI simply because they had that gap in employment. And then finally, the uh, the human bias can create issues where we, like I was giving with my example, where you inadvertently cause harm or trauma to somebody simply by not understanding the results that you got and either parroting or not doing your due diligence to ensure that AI result is what you want to go out into the world, like that image that I put on the slideshow. So you need to ensure that your looking at that stuff. And the prompt I was going to have for discussion kind of has already been talked about, but what other potential impacts does AI bias have in education that you guys can see? The ESL students having their information flagged as AI generated is a great example. Um, I can see one example of students who are from socioeconomically uh, lower areas getting looked over for funding and things like that because the higher uh, funding schools are going to be, look like they're more successful, and therefore it's going to drive AI to say something like, well, these are successful over here and these are unsuccessful over here, without thinking about the fact that they get a lot more money already, and they're going to say, well, we're going to pump money into what's successful as opposed to pumping money, as opposed to giving money where it's needed and can actually help some people uh, bridge the gap. Um, so I'm kind of flying through this, so I don't. I'm going to slow down. So PPS purchased software that can use an LLM to generate comments and grades on student writing. Automation bias research says that this will not be adequately reviewed and could result in harmful comments being delivered to students. Absolutely. Um, that's one of the things we're going to talk about in mitigating bias, is ensuring that the users understand that there's bias in the system so that they can be on the lookout for things like that, so that you don't take a comment that AI spit out and immediately pass it on to a student that could end up harming them. Um, which kind of is a good segue into mitigating AI bias. So, what can you do? Well, the first step is awareness and education, right? So, what we're doing right now is a great example of something we can do to ensure that we are aware that these biases are out there and that anything that we utilize in AI has that potential bias. Um, Understanding where the bias comes from can also help us understand how it will present itself in our responses and in the final product that AI produces. Because if we know that typically this data is going to be biased towards one socioeconomic area or one ethnicity or things like that, we're going to be able to understand that why that might not be represented in the result set, and therefore adjust. Um, and that can work in many different ways, and we can get onto that in a minute. The um, the next step is ensuring that you have critical engagement. Don't accept the AI generated content on face value. Read it, look at it, and if something seems off, it's very likely due to an underlying bias, and you can take this time at that point to try to correct it, either yourself or um, using prompts in the AI to get a better idea of it. I was at a conference this past week, and somebody showed a picture of, the prompt was something as simple as, "Show me a picture of happy children," and the children were all in the happy picture were all white children being very happy, and then when asked to draw a picture of sad children, those children were of non-white. Uh, Sometimes they were African American, sometimes they were Asian, sometimes they were Hispanic, but in all cases, the sad children were non-white, the happy children were white, and the only way to get around that were to prompt them to say, "Please give me a ethnically diverse picture of happy children," and it would at least attempt to do a little bit better. Um, so yeah, so if you, as you're going through utilizing AI, make sure to provide feedback to the engine itself, telling it to, that this appears to be a response that has bias in it, and then also learn how to adjust your prompts based on if you see a bias coming in. Um, Ensure that you can change that prompt to attempt to remove some of that bias. Um, the next thing to do is advocacy and reporting. If you do encounter that bias, utilizing that feedback loop, utilizing any other forms of reviews or things like that. If you're using an app, you can review it in the app store, things like that, to ensure that the companies, the developers that are utilizing these AI algorithms know that that algorithm is presenting biased information, and they can work with their own developers and the developers of the algorithm to try to remove some of that bias. But if they don't know that there's a problem, they don't know what they need to fix. So ensure that you're advocating for a bias-free algorithm and reporting it to the companies that are responsible. Uh, the next thing is, as always, in all things, promoting diversity and inclusion, right? Making sure that when you do engage with AI, that you are ensuring to prompt it in ways that will um, give you diverse and inclusive results from the get-go. So knowing that there is bias in some of these algorithms, you can immediately start with prompts that ask for diversity and inclusion, as opposed to waiting for it to show you bias and then adjusting for that. Um, the next step would be to continuously learn, right? Always, I think Chat GPT came out, I think it was late 2022, early 2023. Um, and it has grown leaps and bounds since even then. It moves fast. So ensure that when you are utilizing AI tools, you're also continuously learning how it's changing, what it's changing, and things like that. Um, the AI detectors is a great example of that. We um, we don't take them at face value. We're doing the due diligence to ensure that we've learned what they can do, what they cannot do, whether or not they're worth it, whether or not they are not worth it. And um, so far, we're seeing that they're not worth it right now. But that doesn't mean that 2 years from now they still won't be worth it. So we have to continue to learn, continue to understand the landscape of AI and how it's changing and driving change in other areas. And then finally, use and support ethical AI tools. Right now, there's no such thing as a standard for unbiased AI. There's no certification that an AI algorithm can get that says, hey, this is verified to be non-biased. But um, there are stories out there, there are anecdotes that people are saying, hey, this one's biased. Hey, I've noticed that this one doesn't have as much bias. And so as you are in your AI journey, look for that. Look for those comments from other people who are using them about bias, and try to steer towards the ones that seem to have less bias in the system to begin with, both as uh, a way to avoid the bias, but also as a way to show companies out there that, hey, we're going to migrate to the ones that don't have as much bias, and so you need to from the very beginning ensure that your algorithms and things like that don't have bias, or we're going to go find somebody else. There's a lot of open source AI out there, which is a double-edged sword. It's something that can be used to ensure that there's multiple input, multiple developers building it, therefore a more diverse group of people building it. But because it's open source, it also can have some bad actors uh, making changes to it and maybe possibly inserting bias into it. So while those are out there and would be good to use, a little bit more of a grain of salt taken there, because you want to ensure that the developers are not putting nefarious things in there. And that is it. I know we went a little quick. Um, I would love to hear any questions anybody had, or um, anything that people want to hear discussed about bias in AI, or or anything along that lines as far as AI goes. And if not, it's uh, it's always something you want to look at, want to ensure that you're uh, have in the front of your mind when dealing with AI, because AI is not going away, unfortunately. So it's going to be here. It's going to be something we're going to be utilizing in education and our regular lives. So if we keep the eye on bias, and if we ensure that um, we can mitigate it whenever we can, we're going to have a better run of it as it expands and grows into many different things in our society and in education.